anti-African in him. Professor Gates is one of our brothers, and he's damaged. He's a classic example of what the chattel slavery system have done to black people.
Yeah.
He's a classic case of post-traumatic slavery disorder, or post-slavery trauma syndrome.
Explain that, people might not be familiar with that term.
I mean, post, of course, means the past. Slavery is the genocidal institution of chattel slavery that was designed in Europe, run from Europe, controlled by Europeans, and spread all over the Americas. And the trauma is the psychological, the spiritual, and the physical injury that came from the chattel slave trade. And syndrome means it continues. It means the damage that was done psychologically, spiritually, physically, socially, culturally, continues to affect the black community today. And so Dr. Gates is a classic example of that damage.
Put a little pin in there then. After 200 years maybe here of enslavement, but the enslavement started centuries before.
Oh, right. See,
in the motherland.
It is so sad, a man who's been trained by the best white institutions in America.
Harvard.
Of course, that speaks of it. Harvard University, who made much of its initial money from the slave trade and the enslavement of African people. That's how Harvard University was built, off of slave money garnered from the enslavement of African peoples. Professor Gates, had he done a little study, the enslavement of Africans had been going on for more than 2,000 years before the Americas, the transatlantic
slave
genocide
trade, yes.
that we call the slave trade.
Right.
The Romans was involved in it, murdering millions of Africans, conquering all of North Africa and Egypt. The Greeks were involved.
It was a slave state, really.
And they were, and they called themselves slave states.
The home of democracy was
and
really a slave
they were carrying out what we call today ethnic cleansing against the Africans in North Africa and in the Nile Valley. And then the Arab, who are the bastardized children of the Greeks and the Romans. They then took over the slave trade, and for 1,500 years, before 1492, they were enslaving Africans from North Africa, from the Sahel, which is the Sudan, northern Nigeria, northern Ghana area, from East Africa all the way down to Malawi, selling them into Europe, the Middle East, and Asia.
Once I heard you speak, excuse me, and you listed the number of invasions. Very important point. I think I brought it up to your attention how important that was. Because this horror that we see in Africa today started centuries ago.
It started 1,700 BC with the invasion of an Asiatic European people called the Hyksos. And they were followed 400 years later after we drove them out of Africa. They came into Northeast Africa, what is now so-called Middle East, used to be Africa populated by Africans. We drove them out, and a few hundred years later they were followed by the Hittites, another European Asian mixed people, and we drove them out. Now we are at about 1,300 BC. They're followed by the Assyrians, another group of white people. And not to be mistaken for the Syria of today. This is the white folks from the Caucasus Mountains. We drive them out. They make a second invasion. We drive them out again. Then we are invaded by the Persians. Not to be confused with the ancient people of Persia who were black. These are the people from what is now Afghanistan who now live in Iran. And so we drive them out. They come with a second invasion.
People must understand that the driving of them out was not like that. It took
black people took hundreds of years to drive these
yes.
Europeans out of Africa. We had a relationship with Greece.
Mm-hmm.
Greece was initially a black settlement on the European continent.
Mm-hmm.
Alexander.
Say that again. Greece was what?
Greece. Ancient Greece, before Alexander, was fundamentally an African settlement on the European peninsula.
People by people, African people of color.
People by African people that look like you and I.
Okay.
Okay? Alexander You remember they always say Alexander of Macedonia.
Yes.
Meaning he's from north of Greece. His father, Philip of Macedonia, is from north of Greece, who married a woman who was as African as you or I. They never talk about this. So Alexander the Great, we thought we were inviting family. We asked him to come with his army and rid us of the Persians. That's what the invasion was. Now Alexander's brother, Cletus, was his general. Now Cletus was known and is known in history as the blackest black. And after they conquered his brother.
Alexander's brother. Alexander the Great's brother.
Yes, his
was
general.
Cletus, and he was black.
Cletus, right. They said it was his black general, but they don't tell you he was the brother. But they'll tell you that when he kills Cletus, he murders Cletus in a drunken stupor in Persia, and Cletus turns to Alexander and says, "Fool that you are, you've killed your mother's son." That's a part of their written history.
Yeah.
But Alexander dies shortly after the conquest of Egypt, and his generals took over Egypt under the Ptolemy. And Egypt then would not get back into black hands for quite some time.
Is that why when you go to the museum and you go to the Egyptian exhibits, you see Ptolemy, and
yes,
you see in
Ptolemy,
Egypt?
Right.
Yeah.
But the Greeks did not have enough numbers to replenish themselves, so they became black after a while. So there were 7 major Cleopatras. Cleopatra was the title of the queen from the line of the Ptolemies marrying and the black women.
So
but
Cleopatra
eventually
is a
these
title.
white-skinned, Cleopatra is a title, not the name of a person.
Okay.
So these light-skinned mixed group, the Greeks was like our Latino brothers and sisters. They became black because the black was the dominant population there, and they're marrying into that population. So the Romans then invade.
Could I hold for just a minute? Coming there like that, they were also conquerors, but settling, but they were also taking the knowledge from Kemet, from Egypt.
Well, Plato,
yeah.
There's a book called Phaedrus, written by Plato, and he gives African credits for the invention of geometry, the invention of mathematics, the invention of medicine, but he said the greatest science of all that the Africans gave to the world was the science of writing itself.
Go ahead.
This is Plato. And you get the same thing from Euripides, from Aristotle. They all give us credit. But Herodotus, in his book 2 on history, just pulls the cover off of everything. I would tell anybody, go to the library, get Herodotus book 2, and he'll tell you the Egyptians were black, and he'll tell you that even the very gods in the pantheon of Egypt were copied from the gods, meaning the pantheon of Greece was copied from the gods of Egypt. Even in the Odyssey and the Iliad, Homer writes that the gods of Greece must go to Egypt every season to renew themselves.
Okay, so those were some of the invaders. But and we're saying all this to let our audience know how the people were pushed.
Right. I want to mention
invaded.
one more major invasion, because this was the catastrophic one. In the 630s, after the death of Prophet Muhammad, who himself was an African, and people don't want to deal with it, but you can deal with me. I'm also one of those titles, Al-Hajj Amin Shahid. I went to Mecca in 1974-75 when I was Imam over Malcolm's Muslim Mosque, Inc. So I'll sit with the best of their scholars on the question. But after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him, you had his cousin, a man named Abu Sufyan's nephew, named Muawiyah. Okay. Well, not Muawiyah. You got Muhammad dies. Abu Bakr takes over. He dies. He's an old man. He doesn't last long. Umar takes over. He is murdered by a man named Uthman. Uthman is the cousin of the Prophet, but he's also married to the Prophet's daughter. Ali is the cousin of the Prophet, also married to the Prophet's daughter. This becomes very important in our history.
It's the same daughter they're married to?
No, different daughters. Different
daughters.
Okay. But Ali is from the bloodline of Muhammad's grandfather. Uthman is from the bloodline of Muhammad's grandfather by adoption, so he wasn't blood related. The very war that now creates the Shia and the Sunni has to do with which of those bloodline is the appropriate one to lead Islam in the world today. And we are not telling the world the truth about what the contradiction is all about. But at any rate, the man who was sent by Abu Sufyan, Muhammad's cousin, to murder him was named Abu al-As, Ibn al-As. After the death of the Prophet, this same assassin who couldn't find the Prophet, because the Prophet was in the cave. There's a surah in the Quran about the cave, where the spiders put their web over the cave, so they didn't go in because nobody can be in there. There's spider web all over the place. And the Prophet was hiding there before escaping to Medina. And so this man led an army to Ethiopia, but the Ethiopian king and his army stopped him at the border. Instead of the Muslims who the Prophet Muhammad sent, peace be upon him, for safety in Ethiopia, that these are our brothers and sisters, and they believe as we do, and you will not have them. That same assassin became the general of the Northern Muslim Army after the death of the Prophet and led